Hello! Today I'm taking a look at the increasing speculation around Final Fantasy IX and the implications of both the remake rumours and the news of an animated TV series. Now, since the Final Fantasy VII Remake was released back in 2020, there's been increasing discussion around what other Final Fantasy games could and possibly should be remade. Naturally, many of these discussions hinge around the mid to late 90s era, which saw Final Fantasy VI, VII, VIII and IX released, all of which were met with critical acclaim. And following speculation, leaks, and the nostalgic push of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters, for example, it now seems more likely than ever, with this huge nostalgic push by Square in the wake of Final Fantasy VII, that other Final Fantasy games may be getting revisited and may be getting remade in future. Now, looking specifically at Final Fantasy IX, it's an interesting one, because even at the time of its release, it was distinct from its peers. It stepped away from science fantasy and returned to traditional knights and mages conventions of the earliest titles. And certainly aesthetically, with its anthropomorphic animals and abstract character designs, it employed an art direction that recalled Saturday morning kids' cartoons, largely thanks to the warmth and the unique art style of toy designer turned concept artist Toshiyuki Itahana. So, owing to these distinctions, and looking at the current market, which is riding high on the dark, muddling narratives of Final Fantasy VII and the imminent, equally dark-looking Stranger in Paradise, and so on, it does feel like there's a gap and an opportunity to return to the light-hearted sort of Final Fantasy games, Chocobo Racing, Chocobo GP, World of Final Fantasy, and the earlier Kingdom Hearts titles sort of played up to and attested to. And Final Fantasy IX could fit the bill here and counterbalance the dark vibes of Final Fantasy VII with something that's comparatively light-hearted in ways that Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VIII certainly were not. Now, you may be thinking, and rightly so, that in spite of its light-hearted fantasy world, Final Fantasy IX is actually quite a dark game. And as I covered at length in my Final Fantasy IX review, there is a lot of weighty existential themes and tragedy that's particular to the game, and particularly around characters like Vivi. And these were themes that juxtaposed quite effectively, I think, with the jovial nature and design of what's on the surface. But this is where the speculation around both the anime adaptation and the direction of the potential remake comes in. Because as we've seen with Final Fantasy VII, the remake was quite a curveball contrived to repackage the Final Fantasy VII story as a sequel. And so when it comes to revisiting older games and older Final Fantasies, it seems like all bets are off for how they may be adapted and delivered to a modern audience. Now, for me personally, in light of both the TV series and the remake speculation, it's impossible to say to what extent, if any, that they will change the story. But it does feel like Final Fantasy IX may be heading towards an episodic, multimedia compilation sort of direction with a broader audience in mind than what Final Fantasy VII or other games like that might have targeted. And by that, I don't mean necessarily children specifically, but much like Kingdom Hearts, which famously incorporates Disney and so on, it may employ a more universal approach to story that can explore the struggle between light and dark and even an existential quest for meaning, but in perhaps a less overtly harrowing way than black mages talking about people stopping or the child Vivi watching dozens of black mages plunge to their deaths from an airship, for example. So for me, while some might balk at the rumours of a children's TV show, I don't think that necessarily equates to Final Fantasy IX's story becoming more juvenile, and I think actually it could be very fitting for Final Fantasy IX, extending to a potentially remade game world as well. And really, if we think about Final Fantasy IX, the framework of its story and the truly ensemble composition of its cast, where 1 minute we're playing as Vivi, then we're playing as Zidane, then Steiner, cutting between these respective stories, and even how the game establishes the ensemble cast with the various character trait screens such as virtue, sorrow, dilemma, arrogance, and so on, we can see firstly how the scope for an episodic remake really offers potential for character development that was maybe absent in the first game, with Amarant being a prime example, as he's often considered a party member who didn't get much exploration in the original. But secondly, and going back to the accessible audience idea, these themes and traits of sorrow, virtue, devotion, despair that are appended to each of our characters are so universal and fundamental to human experience that I can really see them working in an accessible game story and taking that life lesson approach to each of its characters that so much young adult fiction tends to do. And even looking at Kuja, for example, he's perfect because rather than being a genuinely evil, scary bad guy at the end of it all, he's actually a very muddled and quite a tragic character that is ultimately quite redemptive in the ending. So again, a story aimed at a universal audience is not something that I feel would detriment Final Fantasy IX, but simply reframe and slightly repackage what's already there. Maybe cut out some of the occasional swear words, put some clothes on Kuja and Lani before giving it to a 10-year-old. But I think that this could very much work, and much like Kingdom Hearts or World of Final Fantasy, which I'm playing at the moment and I'm loving it, Final Fantasy is a broad church, and I think there's equally scope for light and dark, juvenile and mature stories, of which Final Fantasy IX could go either way, depending on how it's packaged and delivered. So, coming on to my final point, because of course this is all speculation off the back of the leaks and the subsequent confirmation of the Chrono Cross remaster, which was among those leaks. Final Fantasy IX could reasonably come in any way, shape or form, and I think each player probably wants and expects something different if this were to come to fruition. But for me, I think a like-for-like remake with perhaps more episodic, involved character stories where they matter, basically just improving and making full scenarios out of the active time event system, which was a very unique element of Final Fantasy IX. I think that's the way to go, doubling down on the ensemble nature of it, exploring the characters a bit more. Because doing the full Final Fantasy VII Remake approach by adding new plot devices, sequelizing and fundamentally changing the Final Fantasy IX story, I feel like it has less relevance here because Final Fantasy IX isn't a flagship Final Fantasy game in the same way that Final Fantasy VII is. There's no need to try and perpetuate and retell and prolong the central story of Zidane, Garnet, Brane and Kuja and so on. And so retaining the core story while possibly building out individual character stories, backstories around it, it feels like the most beneficial and likely way to go for me. And I stated before in my Final Fantasy IX review that actually the core story of Final Fantasy IX, the main thread, looked at a certain way, it tends to matter less than actually the individual characters that comprise that story. And it's much more about the ensemble and the individual character journeys. Again, going back to the virtue, devotion, so on, is reconciling these individual dilemmas rather than the core story itself. So I feel like there's no need to sort of change that and necessarily redo the core story, but it may be a case of fleshing out the characters as they currently stand. We don't need whispers or any of this kind of crazy stuff going on. So there we have it, my brief thoughts and building anticipation, hopefully not unfounded anticipation, about this unique Final Fantasy potentially being revisited down the line in a very big way. I think it's the perfect game to bridge the divide between the dark and the light-hearted applications of Final Fantasy. And where Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VIII are among my favourites, and I can appreciate why some Final Fantasy VIII fans may feel a bit snubbed that this game seems to have been skipped over so far, I can see the business case for this, and the appeal in bringing Final Fantasy IX forwards. It is a little bit different, and it is more accessible and distinct in many ways, I think. And indeed, while I've made many videos about Squall and about Cloud Strife and how very different they are, I can see why kind of sandwiching a Final Fantasy VIII Remake alongside instalments of a Final Fantasy VII may seem a bit too comparable for some audiences, particularly outside audiences, because on the surface at least, we have the moody protagonist of Cloud and we have the moody protagonist of Squall. And then turning to Final Fantasy IX, we have something that is completely divorced from that with Zidane, and is something that is currently missing from the Final Fantasy franchise. So I can see why they may have done this, and I'm definitely all for Final Fantasy IX Remake. So if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this brief episode off the back of the news that some of those leaks have been confirmed. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts about the potential for a Final Fantasy IX Remake and a Final Fantasy IX TV show.